Hello and welcome to the video on the 2025 updates on the Koreas. And to be exact, we're talking about the early October 2025 updates on the Koreas. As I'll talk about momentarily, things can change really quickly. So my original plan, I last taught this class in 2023, and I made a video talking about, trying to bring things up to speed in a sense where we are with North and South Korea. And I was thinking for 2025, I'm like, I'm going to redo those lectures. And then as I looked at it, I was like, a lot of things stayed the same. And it doesn't make sense to just do the exact same lecture again if the first recording, the quality was okay. But then there were some things that changed. And I thought, what would make more sense is to just do like a 2025 update and talk about things that have changed. And that might help us to get a sense of just how dynamic the peninsula is, how there are things going on. And one thing it's important, that's difficult in doing with history, is getting people to see how the past that we understood to have happened, the people going through it didn't see it happening, right? So when you start World War II, you don't know who's going to win World War II, right? We don't know. And so I had to talk about things and trends not knowing what was going to happen. So it's kind of fun, I think, to go back and look at what I said previously and say, this is how things have changed. And there's some funny things in a cosmic sense that happened as well. So one thing you may recall was I did this kind of trend. I looked at South Korean presidents. And you remember I talked about how some of them get arrested, right? So we had former President Lee Myung-bak and former President Park Geun-hye. And I noted that it gets confusing. I don't usually worry about political parties so much in Korea because they change their names all the time. So it's better to think more of kind of the political orientation. So these would be on the conservative side. And just remember, conservative tends to be pro-US and tends to say we should take a more adversarial stance towards North Korea. The left tends to be more not anti-US, but not as pro-US, if that makes sense. And also tends to say we need to dialogue with South Korea. So just keep that in mind. So you may recall I talked in about how the current president was Yoon Suk-yeol. And I even had, as of time of recording, just to make sure that it was clear that, things change. And of course, eventually, you don't stay president forever. Unless you're Kim Il-sung, he is president forever of North Korea. It's in their constitution. But in any case, I mentioned Yoon Suk-yeol. I said he is in office. And I made a joke. I'm like, okay, hopefully nothing will happen to him. And then in October of 2024, I made I gave a talk about South Korea to the local community in Greenwood. And of course, I included a similar slide. And I made reference to, I made a joke about that. And I said, same kind of joke, just, hey, hopefully nothing will happen to this guy. All right. So a bit of foreshadowing there. So one thing that happened in February 2024 there were elections. And notice there it gives the name of the parties. And again, this is confusing because the People Power Party is actually conservative, right? The Democratic Party is liberal, which I guess makes a little bit more sense if you're coming from an American perspective. But one thing to note, and this is a screenshot from Wikipedia, these were not the presidential elections. These were elections for the legislature. And what's important to note is that the number on the last election is how well that party did in the election. And the before election, that's what their numbers were before the election. So this is the numbers of people in the legislature. So notice that the Democratic Party, the opposition to who? President Yoon Suk-yeol, they did better in the election than the government did, right? So the conservatives, Yoon Suk-yeol. So Yoon Suk-yeol was having trouble governing because he was president who was conservative, but the legislature was liberal. And what happened is this election made it harder for him to govern because his party lost seats, the opposition gained seats. So if you're President Yoon Suk-yeol, you're very frustrated, right? Because you're the president of a country. You have policies that you want to kind of undertake, things that you think need to be done, but you face a legislature that is not simply like that. There's a strong opposition. The opposition literally dominates the legislature, right? Dominates, right? So notice his party only had like, out of 300 people, only had like 133 in the legislature. So he can't really get anything that he wants to do done. And there's different strategies that you could follow to deal with this if you're a president, to try and do something, right? There's different strategies. You could maybe try and compromise some more. You could try and build some kind of coalition. You could try and move maybe towards a little bit towards the middle. Hopefully you can get more people. That's hard to do. But in any case, there's strategies that you can do. One strategy that I would not have thought of, that President Yoon Suk-yeol thought of, was to declare martial law. Right. And he did this in December of 2024. So just to note, I made a joke about this in 2023, right? And then I gave a talk in late October 2024. And then in early December, we have declaration of martial law. So all these people were teasing me. It's like, wow, you really told the future there. And I'm like, well, I wish I didn't. This is not good. But basically, it's the president declared martial law, and he had a list of opposition lawmakers he wanted arrested. And he did that thing. And it was really not something that people in the Korean studies world were expecting. This is something we thought was just completely off the table in the Republic of Korea. Now, what ended up happening was the whole thing turned out to be a farce. For one thing, if you look it up, there are images of soldiers, confronting civilians and things like that. But one thing that became very clear was the soldiers did not have their hearts in it. They were really not interested in taking any kind of aggressive action against the crowd, right? There's even some pictures of them pointing guns at civilians, but those are rare. I don't think anyone was killed or even shot, wounded. They really were not into it. And that's one thing. And my understanding is that basically the president had like a list of, I don't want to go too into weeds in this. It would be interesting to see once after the trial, we'll have a better idea. But like I said, the president had a list of people he wanted arrested, but he couldn't actually like get anyone to arrest them. So the president didn't have a lot of buy-in with his coup. The military didn't really, like I said, they went through things really half-hearted. They dragged their feet as much as possible. They didn't really, they weren't too interested in it. In supporting it, and I think most opposed it. Remember, South Korea has a primarily conscript army. Most of the people in the army are just average, everyday people who are serving out their mandatory conscription. Remember, that's something men have to do. And so they're not into it. The other big mistake that the president made was, this is a liberal democracy. They have checks and balances. And one balance against martial law is that I think it's a simple majority of Congress can overwhelm it, right? The South Korean legislature. So all that had to have happened to overcome martial law would be to get a quorum of legislators in the legislature building and vote against martial law. That's all they had to do. And if you're not familiar with the term quorum just means the number of people in a meeting you have to have in order for the meeting to be an official meeting and to take votes, right? So you couldn't just have like 5 members of the House of Representatives come together, declare themselves the House of Representatives, and like pass legislature. You have to have a certain number of legislators actually show up before you can take official votes. So that's all you had to do. So the idea is that if the president was really on the ball, he would have made sure that the legislatures could not get to the Congress building. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the Korean name for it, but just make sure they can't actually get to the place they need to go to vote. If you can just stop them from doing that, you can stop them from voting down martial law. But if they can get into the building and actually vote, then, and I think all they need is a majority, then you're in trouble. And that's exactly what happened, was that basically a bunch of legislators just managed to get their way through the military, which is proof that the military was not really interested in stopping them. I mean, if the military did not want people to get in the building, they could have stopped them from getting in the building. But they were able to get legislators, including members of the president's own party, were able to get into the into the building. Once they got their quorum, they voted, I believe, unanimously. So not necessarily every legislator. Every legislator was not able to get in there, but every legislator present, including the president's own party, voted down martial law and said, this is dumb. We're not doing this. So I think martial law lasted a few hours, right? So this was just bizarre, right? And it seems like what happened, we talk about the dangers of echo chambers. It sounds like the president was frustrated with his inability to get any work done and became convinced that it was because of primarily North Korean interference, that basically the opposition party, and I do want to be careful here. I don't want to put all the blame. I mean, this is really bad of the president. He should not have done this. But the opposition party was really interested in opposition, and they were making it difficult at times, my understanding is, to do the basic job of the government. The president then looked at that and said, these guys are being paid off by the North Koreans, which is, there has been cases of South Korean politicians being influenced by North Korea. I don't want to take away from that, but not to the degree, certainly, that the president thought. Right, so the president of South Korea becomes convinced that there's all this North Korean interference, and he has to introduce martial law, arrest a bunch of people. He thinks, and I think he believed this sincerely, that when he arrested the people, he could then get them to confess and to the fact that North Korea was influencing them. I don't think this is true, right? I don't think that there was massive North Korean interference. I think they just acted like politicians in liberal democracies act, right? When they're in power, they try and do what they can. When they're not in power, they try and prevent the opposing party from doing what it wants to do. They were just acting like politicians. I don't mean that as a knock. I mean, that's how these things work. But the president became convinced that it was North Korean influence that was doing this. So then, what ends up happening is the president is ordered to be arrested. There are multiple attempts to try and arrest him. And there's real fears of violence if he is arrested. So on there's the police on the right. Those are pro-president supporters on the left. And you notice they've got an American flag, right? So that's one thing. If you're looking at demonstration, one way you can tell if it's what group it is if they're waving American flags. You'll have Korean citizens waving American flags. That marks them as conservatives, people who see the United States as the protector of South Korea and as an ideal to strive for. So it took multiple attempts to actually arrest the president. And finally, I think he just realized this is crazy and basically said, okay, fine, you can arrest me. And we're currently waiting for the trial to be done. It doesn't look great for South Korea in a sense. This was, a terribly embarrassing moment. It's just crazy because basically you just had a president try and basically have it was confusing because he's in power, so it's not quite a normal coup, but basically trying to seize all the power through this martial law declaration when there wasn't the kind of threat that he claimed there to be, right? South Korea was not under any kind of threat that you can use to justify martial law. And so this is not a good look. We'll see more after the trial, and that's where I want to go into more detail in the future, I hope. But one thing I just want to note, it could have been so much worse. To my knowledge, I don't think there was any deaths in all of this, right? There was no widespread rioting or political violence, right? In a sense, this sounds really weird because, like I said, this was a serious crisis, but Koreans dealt with it really well. Right. And a lot of it is there was a lot of shenanigans like I don't want to get too much into, like, it was really hard to get, like, in order to put the president on trial or to actually remove the president from office, they had to get like at least 8 Supreme Court justices, but there's only 7. They were waiting to get to appoint others. There's all this fighting about the 8th appointment, all these things like it. It does not look good in many respects. But like I said, it could have been so much worse. Right? There could have been violence. There could have been terrorism. There could have been killings. There could have been a lot of terrible things that happened, and it didn't. It looks like the rule of law will prevail. And I think that's something that, as much as in some way Koreans are embarrassed by the situation, crises are going to happen. I don't care what political system it is. Crises are going to happen. I'm more thinking, how do people handle the crises? That's what impresses me, right? Everyone has crises. The question is, how do you handle them? And I think Koreans handled them and have been handling them very well. Hopefully that will continue, right? Because it's not done because they're still trying to figure out what to do with the president. So the new president is Lee Jae-myung, and he is on the political left. So that means he has a complex relationship with the U.S. And so, again, I'm kind of oversimplifying, but basically the political right in Korea says North Korea is a serious threat. It's our primary threat. They are aggressive towards us. We need and especially now as China is getting more powerful, we really need a strong ally, and that's the U.S. We really need to look to the U.S. I have to be a little careful because the position on the left is a little bit more complex. They're not like, there's a lot of anti-Americanism on the left, but in terms of the actual practical politics, they're like, yeah, we need the United States, right? We need to have an alliance with the United States. That's important, but it's not as important. And it does limit us. And we want to reduce that dependence on the U.S. And we think we can if we can get along well with North Korea. And so what we need to do is not to be confrontational with North Korea and to have dialogue with North Korea. And if we do that, we can lower the tensions and maybe even have unification. And if we get unified, or at least if we lower tensions, we won't be as dependent on the U.S., and that will give us more freedom to act in the way that we think we need to. Right. So in a sense, if we can have good relations with North Korea, that actually increases national independence. And a lot of that's, in a sense, what they're kind of looking at is the right says we increase national strength and independence by close ties with the United States. The left is saying we still need some ties to the United States, but we need to back off a bit. And that might help. And a lot of people on the left would say that the close ties to the United States actually make it harder to work with North Korea. And President Lee Jae-myung, I think, came in with high hopes that he would be able to do a lot because relationships with North Korea and President Yoon Suk-yeol's government were very bad, right? They were very bad. Let me give you an example of this. So what happened in South Korea, there are various organizations that take balloons and then put things. They're strong enough balloons that they can carry like a little cargo, like they could maybe carry some pamphlets or some socks or some money or something like that, or anti-North Korean leader leaflets, and they would float them in over North Korea, and then some of the balloons will, they'll eventually leak or pop, and the stuff will come down, and North Koreans can get it. Right. So it might be a USB disc with some documentaries or some soap operas on it. It could be a lot of different things, depending on your group. For example, Christian groups would send Bibles. Some people sent money, US dollars sometimes, sent a lot of different things. The North Korean government hates this. North Korean government hates this a lot and makes it clear that it hates it. And they don't want any outside information, right? They don't want anyone getting outside information. And there's always this kind of debate in South Korea about this, because on one side you can say this is free expression. On the other side, there's people who say, but there's limits to free expression because it's actually endangering the lives of the people who live near the DMZ. It's a complex question. I'm not going to weigh in on the legal issues, except to note that it's not the South Korean government that does this. There are people in South Korea who do this, and there's other people in South Korea who say that the government should not allow this. So the government on the left tends not to like this, right? Because they want good relations with North Korea. The North Koreans hate this, so they say, okay, we can't do this. The government on the right says, but people have freedom, and we're reducing people's freedom of speech to share their ideas. And again, I'm not weighing in on this, but the key thing is under Moon Jae-in, a person on the left, that president, he had seen that this was stopped. His government put a stop to this. Under Yoon Suk-yeol, this was allowed again. And so what ends up happening is the North Koreans get very angry and they start sending trash balloons south. So they start filling up their own balloons, but instead of putting like useful things in them or even anti-South Korean propaganda, they literally put in trash and garbage, including human feces. So it's really gross. And that's on the right. That's a picture of the aftermath of one of these trash balloons that has come down. Like, it's really, really gross. So as you can guess, President Lee Jae-myung, right, was hopeful that he could take an approach towards towards North Korea that would be better, right? That they would actually start being able to have dialogue. It's hard not to improve on this situation, right? Where you've got literally bags of, they start calling them poop balloons, right? When a country's sending poop balloons in your country, the relations are not going well, and you're hopeful that things can change. And of course, that's what President Lee Jae-myung is hoping, that things will change.